What would you do if everything you had ever been given, every lesson, every callus, every quiet morning, watching someone else's hands move with purpose, suddenly became the only standing between you and nothing? We've been thinking about that question for a long time, and we think you have too, in one way or another. This is the story of Clementine Ashby, and it starts the way so many stories do, with a door closing. She was 22 years old when her uncle changed the lock, not in the middle of a fight, not after some dramatic falling out. He just did it one Tuesday morning in late October, while she was still inside gathering her things, and when she came downstairs with her bag and her coat and the small tin box she kept her savings in, the new key was sitting on the kitchen table beside a note that said, "This arrangement no longer suits." That was it. No explanation, no apology, no forwarding address for the grief she would need to send somewhere. Clementine Ashby had been living with her Uncle Edmund Ashby, her father's younger brother, a man who smiled with his mouth only, since she was 14 years old, when both her parents died within 6 months of each other. First her father, from a fall on the ice. Then her mother, from the kind of grief that doesn't get a name in any medical textbook. She had grown up in that house, learning to take up very little space. She kept her room tidy. She did not ask for much. She worked shifts at the diner on Route 7 3 mornings a week, and gave Edmund half of everything she made, because he said that was fair, and she had not yet learned enough about fairness to disagree. But before the diner, and before Edmund's house, and before all of it, there was Wallace Kincaid. Wallace Kincaid had been her father's oldest friend, a cooper by trade, a barrel maker, in a town that no longer had much use for barrel makers, which meant he spent most of his time repairing furniture, fixing porch steps, building cold frames for kitchen gardens, and occasionally making a barrel for someone who simply wanted one for the aesthetic. He was 64 years old when Clementine was 14, and he had a shop behind his house on Birch Hollow Road that smelled like cedar shavings and linseed oil, and the particular dusty warmth of a wood stove kept going all winter. He had taken one look at her, standing on his porch 3 weeks after her mother's funeral with nowhere else to go before Edmund's car arrived, and said, "You know how to use a draw knife?" She had not. By spring she did. Wallace Kincaid did not adopt her, did not attempt to become a replacement for anything she had lost. What he did was quieter than that and more lasting. He taught her to read wood grain the way other people read weather. He taught her the names of joints, dovetail, mortise and tenon, box joint, bridle, and why each one existed and what each one could bear. He taught her that a well-made thing is an argument, and that the argument is, "I was here and I paid attention." She worked beside him every Saturday for 4 years. He paid her nothing, because he had very little money himself, but he also never let her leave empty-handed. Some weeks it was a technique, some weeks it was a tool. And one Saturday in September, 2 months before she turned 18, 2 months before Edmund decided her staying any longer was no longer convenient, Wallace had handed her an old wooden mallet, the handle worn smooth and dark from decades of use, the head refaced twice in his own workshop. "This was the first thing I ever made," he said, "before I knew what I was doing, which is maybe why it's held up so well." She had laughed. He had not. "Take it," he said. "It'll remind you that not knowing what you're doing is not the same thing as not being able to do it." Wallace Kincaid died the following February, quietly in his sleep, the way people who have worked hard all their lives sometimes do, as if they have finally earned the right to exit without a fuss. She had not seen him again before he died. Edmund did not approve of the visits. She had not fought hard enough about that, and she had carried that particular weight ever since. So, 22 years old. One bag, one tin of savings, $430, which sounds like something until you live somewhere in rural Nova Scotia in November, and then it sounds like the setup to a joke with no punchline. The mallet in her bag, wrapped in a flannel shirt, and the deed to Wallace Kincaid's property, which his lawyer had mailed to her 6 months earlier, which she had reread so many times, the fold lines had gone soft. He had left her the shop, not the house. The house went to a distant nephew, but the shop behind it, and the tools inside it. She had not known what to do with that information while she was still under Edmund's roof. A shop, with no house attached, in a town she hadn't lived in since she was a child. It had felt like a riddle she wasn't ready to answer. Standing on Edmund's porch with a note that said this arrangement no longer suits, she decided she was ready. The drive to Bridgewater took 3 hours on a bus that stopped 7 times, and Clementine spent most of it looking out the window at the trees which had gone bare and gray, and trying not to calculate how many nights $400 would buy her if the shop turned out to be unusable. She had never been back to Birch Hollow Road since the year she turned 14. She remembered it as longer than it was, the way childhood roads always are. She remembered Wallace's house as larger. She remembered the shop as a kind of sanctuary, which turned out to be the one memory that held. The nephew, a man named Douglas something, who had the pinched look of a person who has recently been disappointed by a will, met her at the property line to hand over the key to the shop and to make it very clear that his ownership of the house began exactly at the property stake, marked with orange paint, and that her ownership of the shop ended exactly there. He said this 3 times in 3 slightly different ways. Clementine said, "Understood," each time, because she was tired and cold and did not have the energy to tell him she had not come all this way to fight over 2 feet of frozen ground. The shop was smaller than she remembered. It was also colder than she had hoped, and when she pushed the door open, the smell hit her. Cedar, linseed oil, the ghost of a wood stove. And for a moment she had to put her hand on the doorframe and just stand there. She stood there for a while. Then she went inside. The tools were all still there, covered in dust, a few rusted at the edges, some needing sharpening. But there, chisels in their roll, planes on the shelf. The old workbench, solid as it had always been, the surface scarred with years of use in a way that looked like a record of something rather than damage. She took stock. This is what she had. The shop, which had no heat. A sleeping bag she had packed without being entirely sure why. Enough food for 3 days. $430. 8 years of Saturday mornings. 1 mallet. She lit the wood stove with paper and a piece of kindling she found in the box beside it, and she sat on the floor while it caught, and she let herself feel for exactly the length of time it took the fire to take hold, the full weight of where she was and how she had gotten here. Then the fire was going, and she stood up. She had work to do. Her first job came from a woman named Sylvia Okafor, who ran the gift shop on King Street, and who had seen Clementine taping a handwritten card to the community board at the library. The card said, "Woodworking and furniture repair, reasonable rates, references available upon request." The references were Wallace, who was dead, but she had letters he had written her over the years that were the closest thing to a reference she could imagine. Sylvia Okafor needed a display case repaired. One of the shelves had come loose from its dado joint, and whoever had attempted to fix it before had used the wrong glue and made it worse. Clementine looked at it for a long time, asked a few questions, said she could have it done by Friday, and named a price that was, she would later realize, far too low. She had it done by Wednesday. Sylvia looked at the case, ran her finger along the repaired joint, pressed down on the shelf, and then looked at Clementine with an expression that was not quite surprise but was adjacent to it. "Who taught you to do this?" she asked. "A man named Wallace Kincaid," Clementine said. "He had a shop on Birch Hollow Road." Sylvia was quiet for a moment. "I know that name," she said. "He made my dining table 18 years ago. I still have it." Clementine did not say anything. She did not trust herself to say anything. "You should charge more," Sylvia said, and paid her the price she'd asked anyway. That was December. By February, Clementine had a waiting list. "We should tell you something about Bridgewater in winter, because it matters for what comes next. It is a town that has seen better decades, the way many small Nova Scotia towns have. The kind of place where the hardware store has been run by the same family for 4 generations, and everyone knows it. And the diner on the main road serves coffee that is genuinely terrible, but everyone drinks anyway, because it is the coffee of that place, and that is reason enough. It is also a town where people talk, and where being talked about is its own kind of currency, and where doing good work quietly and without complaint is noticed more than people let on." Clementine did not know this yet. She knew she was being looked at. She was young and female, and operating out of a shop that most people associated with an old man who had been gone for almost 3 years. And she was aware that some people who came to see her work came more out of curiosity than genuine need. She did not mind that. She had been curious herself once, standing in a doorway, watching someone else's hands. She did not make friends easily. That is not the same as saying she was unfriendly. She was simply someone who had learned to be careful about the difference between people who were interested in her and people who were interested in what she could do for them. But there was a man named Theodore Galt. Theodore Galt was 61 years old and had owned a building on Main Street for 30 years. The building had 4 units, a barber shop on the ground floor, 2 apartments above, and a 4th space at the back, a garage bay, essentially, with a side door to the alley that had been empty for 7 years since the automotive shop that occupied it moved out. He came to Clementine in January because his upstairs tenant's bathroom door had swollen in its frame and wouldn't close properly. And the tenant, a retired schoolteacher named Patrice, had been complaining about it politely for 6 weeks, which was, Theodore said, the most terrifying form of complaint he had encountered in 30 years of being a landlord. Clementine fixed the door in an hour. While she was there, Theodore noticed her looking at the empty Ashby through the window, which was visible from the stairwell. Thinking about the space, he said. She turned around. Sorry, just noticed it was empty. 7 years, he said. Can't get the right fit. He paused. How much space do you have where you're working? She told him. She told him about the shop on Birch Hollow Road. Small, uninsulated, no running water. A wood stove that had to be fed every 3 hours through the night in January, or the water in the tin cup she kept on. The shelf froze solid. Theodore Galt looked at her for a long moment. I'll do you a deal, he said. 12 months at half rate, in exchange for repairs on the building. I have a list. After 12 months we renegotiate. Nothing signed until you've walked through the space and decided it's worth it to you. She walked through the space. It had high ceilings, it had electricity, it had a utility sink. It had 3 south-facing windows that let in enough winter light to work by. She thought about the wood stove on Birch Hollow Road. She thought about waking up at 3 in the morning to feed it. When can I move in? She said. We want to pause here, because this is the part where the story could go several ways. And the way it actually went is the part we find most worth telling. Because here is the thing about Clementine Ashby. By the time she had been in Bridgewater for 6 months, she was surviving and she was doing good work, and there were people who respected her for both of those things. But she was also still carrying a particular weight that she had never quite been able to put down. The weight had a name. The name was Edmund, not because she was afraid of him, not because she was angry, exactly. Or rather, she was, but it was a specific kind of anger, the kind that comes from realizing, too late and all at once, that you had accepted a version of yourself that was never true, that you had been small because someone needed you to be small, and that you had believed it long after you should have stopped. And she had never said a word about it to anyone in Bridgewater, because it was not the kind of thing she knew how to say. This is where Edna Marlowe comes in. Edna Marlowe was 81 years old and had lived in Bridgewater her entire life and had opinions about everything in it, with a clarity that could be mistaken, at first meeting, for bluntness, but was actually something more precise. She had simply stopped treating tactfulness as a virtue when it served to protect the wrong people. She came to Clementine in late March because she wanted a blanket chest made. Not repaired, made, from scratch. She wanted it in cherry wood, with hand-cut dovetails at the corners, and she wanted the inside lined with cedar, and she wanted a carved panel on the front. Nothing elaborate, she said, just a simple botanical motif. Leaves or vines, she didn't care which. Clementine asked her questions. Edna answered them directly. Then she looked around the shop. She had come to the new location on Main Street, which was already beginning to look like a place rather than a temporary arrangement, and said, "You're Wallace Kincaid's girl." Clementine looked up from the notepad she had been sketching on. "He taught me," she said carefully. "I know," Edna said. "He talked about you, before he died. At the hardware store, of all places. You know what Wallace was like. He'd tell a story to anyone who stood still long enough. He said he had a student who was going to be better than him by 30. Clementine put the pencil down. "He never told me that," she said. "No," Edna said. "He wouldn't have. He thought it would make you stop trying." She picked up a small wooden box from the shelf, a practice piece Clementine had made in February, finger-jointed, nothing remarkable, and turned it over in her hands. "He was wrong about that," she said. "But he was right about most things." They worked out the details of the blanket chest. Edna paid a deposit without being asked. On her way to the door, she paused. "You're living in the shop?" "I have a room at the Hanson house," Clementine said. "On Elm Street." "Good," Edna said. "You should eat properly. You look like someone who forgets to eat when they're working." This was entirely accurate. The blanket chest took 6 weeks. During those 6 weeks, Clementine also repaired a rocking chair for Theodore Galt's list, rebuilt a set of kitchen cabinet doors for a family on the south end of town, and made a small side table for Sylvia Okafor that Sylvia immediately sold in the shop to a woman from Halifax for 3 times what she had paid for it. Sylvia told Clementine about the sale, told her exactly what the buyer had said, that the joinery was exceptional, that it looked like the kind of piece you found in an antique shop, except that it was new, that she'd have paid more, and then said, "You need to raise your prices. That is not a suggestion." Clementine raised her prices. The waiting list did not shorten. In May, Edmund Ashby came to Bridgewater. She did not know he was coming. There was no warning. She was in the middle of fitting the cedar lining into the blanket chest. A fiddly process, getting the tongue and groove panels to sit flush without gaps. When the door to the shop opened and he walked in, and she knew who it was before she looked up, because she recognized the sound of his footstep, which was one of those things you learn without intending to when you live in someone's house for 8 years. He looked the same, a little grayer at the temples, the same coat. "I heard you'd set up here," he said. She straightened up. She was holding a small rubber mallet. She had reached for it out of habit, and she was aware of it in her hand. "Yes," she said. Edmund looked around the shop with the particular expression of a man who is trying to find something to diminish and can't locate it quickly enough. His eyes moved over the workbench, the tools, the blanket chest in progress on the sawhorses. "You seem to be doing all right," he said in a tone that was not quite a compliment. "I am," she said. There was a silence. Edmund moved a step further into the shop, and she did not move at all. "I wanted to see how you were getting on," he said. "You've seen," she said. He looked at her, then really looked, for what felt like the first time in a long time, or possibly ever. And she held his gaze, because she was standing in her own shop, on a floor she swept every morning, in front of work she had done herself, with a waiting list on the clipboard by the door, and a deposit from Edna Marlowe in the cash box under the bench. She was not unremarkable. She had never been unremarkable. She had just been in the wrong room with the wrong person for too long, and the room had told her a story about herself that was not true. "You should go," she said. "I have work to do." Edmund left. She watched the door close behind him. Then she went back to the cedar lining, because the panels weren't going to fit themselves, and she had promised Edna the chest by Friday. "We'll tell you something, and we want you to hear it plainly." Clementine did not confront Edmund with a speech. She did not get an apology. She did not receive some dramatic moment of public vindication that made everything balance out the way a scales tips when you add the right weight. What she got was a door that was hers to close, and that, it turns out, is its own kind of fortune, not the kind you find, the kind you build. Slowly, from scratch, with the right joints, so that it holds. The blanket chest was finished on a Thursday. Edna Marlowe came to collect it with her grandson, who had a truck, and who, at Edna's direction, was very careful with the loading. Edna ran her hand over the dovetail corners. She opened the lid and held it, testing the hinges. Clementine had sourced old brass hardware from a salvage shop in Lunenburg, which had taken longer than expected. She looked at the carved panel on the front. Not leaves in the end, but a simple branch of wild rose, which Clementine had decided on herself after Edna had said, 3 weeks in, "I trust your judgment." Edna looked at it for a long time. "Wallace was right," she said. "You're better than 30. Clementine was 22. She did not say this. She just smiled and helped carry the chest to the truck and stood in the doorway of the shop on Main Street and watched it go. By the end of that first year in Bridgewater, she had filled the waiting list twice over. She had hired a part-time assistant, a 17-year-old named Fraser, who had wandered in one afternoon asking if she needed help sanding, and who turned out to have the same particular quality of stillness and attention that she had recognized in herself at 14, standing in a doorway, watching someone else's hands. She was teaching him the names of the joints: dovetail, mortise and tenon, box joint, bridle. She was teaching him why each one existed and what each one could bear. On the workbench beside the current project, the old mallet sat where she always kept it within reach, the handle dark and smooth, the head refaced twice in someone else's workshop decades before she was born. Not knowing what you're doing is not the same thing as not being able to do it. She had not yet told Fraser that story. She was waiting for the right moment, the moment when he needed it most, and would know, without her saying, that it was meant for him. We leave you with a question, and we mean it sincerely. Think about the person who handed you something, a skill, a tool, a way of looking at a problem, and then left before they could see what you did with it. What have you built with what they gave you? We'd love to know. Leave it in the comments. We read everyone.